How you doing, everyone? This is Willie Mandrell. I am one of your three hosts for Cash Flow Giants. Myself personally, I'm a real estate investor, have been for the last 13 years. And on the call with me today is Lior as well. I'll let you introduce yourself, Lior.
Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Lior, and I am also a real estate investor. Been investing for over 4 years now. With experience, done everything: condo developments, buy and hold rentals, but really shifting our focus to the rental strategy. So excited to share the knowledge with you guys today.
Yeah, so Cash Flow Giants, myself, Lior, and Andrew Shannon put this together to just help educate the public. Our focus here with Cash Flow Giants is all about the long-term multifamily buy and hold investor, someone who is who has their eyes on the prize, the long game, that's playing the long game here. And Cash Flow Giants is really just all about our experience and helping others not make the same mistakes that we've made. Go through the process and just build a portfolio that allows you to retire and retire comfortably, based on that cash flow.
Exactly. So yeah, hopefully you guys can learn not only the fundamentals, but really the deeper strategies and tactics that have enabled us to grow out quite a significant portfolio, and use that to either start or continue growing your own personal portfolio, so you can achieve the wealth and the freedom that you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're going to be talking about the 20 terms that you must know to become a successful real estate investor. These are the 20 terms that we feel like there's a lot of lingo in the market. There's a lot of terms being thrown around on a regular basis, but these are the 20 terms that we feel like you must know to really become successful. And as we go through them, we're going to pick out the ones that are like super important, and some ones that you can kind of, you really don't necessarily need to know the definitions and all the calculations, but just kind of understanding what they are to get yourself comfortable in that space. So as we go through, we hope this is extremely helpful for you guys.
Let's talk about what a buyer's market is. Basically, all a buyer's market is when you have so many homes for sale, right? And it's larger than the number of buyers out there. So basically, the implication that's really important for you to understand is a buyer in this kind of market would have all the leverage, right? So there's more buyers, there's more homes than there are buyers. So a buyer will have all the negotiating leverage when talking to a seller, right? So you typically see these, you don't see these in a hot market. If you think about what's been going on in most markets across the U.S. from 2012 to 2020, it's been kind of the opposite, where buyers have less leverage. So a buyer's market typically occurs more after a recession, and not towards the peak of a market when sellers gain a lot of the leverage. Now, what's really important to understand is with a buyer's market, again, not only do buyers have leverage in terms of selection, but they also have leverage in terms of price, negotiating power, terms. So they really can control. They can really play the cards and control much more. They can and exhibit much more control over transaction than they typically can.
Yeah, so it's all about economics here. At the end of the day, a buyer's market is when you have more inventory than you do demand. Let's say you have 10 homes for every one buyer that's qualified out there. Then a buyer is going to have more negotiating power, as Lior mentioned, because they have other selections. If you as a seller are not willing to negotiate with them or bring your price down or adjust your terms, they can move on to the next house. And you as a seller only have so many buyers out there for that one home that you're trying to sell. So in a buyer's market, you do have more leverage as a buyer and less leverage as a seller. A seller's market. A seller's market is the opposite of a buyer's market. A seller's market is when the seller has the upper hand. You have more buyers that are qualified to buy, that are looking for inventory, and you have less inventory. Opposite to a buyer's market, a seller's market might be when you have one home that's available for every 10 buyers that are qualified and ready to make a purchase. In this particular situation, the seller has the advantage. The seller can basically just say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, if you're not willing to accept my price, or my terms, there are 9 other buyers out there right now that are looking for this particular home, and we can move on. In a seller's market, prices tend to move upward as well, because of the small amount of inventory and the large amount of buyers compared to that inventory.
Yeah, and the real implication when you're actually going out to buy homes or investment property, like Willie said, is in a seller's market, you're going to be competing against a lot of other buyers for a very limited amount of homes. So what you'll typically see is offers that go over asking price. You'll typically see buyers that are dropping contingencies, like home inspection contingencies, financing contingencies. Usually, this is when we see a lot of quote unquote cash offers, right? Offers that have zero contingencies, that are very strong and are essentially putting a lot of money at risk in order to have a chance to secure the deal.
So appreciation. Appreciation is basically, it's a very simple term. It's basically just the home value going upward. You buy a home, for example, at 300,000, and maybe a few years down the road in an appreciating market, the value goes up and the home is worth 330,000. And this typically happens because of supply and demand as well. When you have limited inventory and there is a strong demand for housing, you start to see prices going up. It's like anything else in the free market. If you have 10 people, that are qualified and want housing, then and there's only 2 or 3 homes available, then you start to see prices go up, and that is the push upward. It's called appreciation.
Yeah, and appreciation really, in terms of how it affects us as potential investors, is it really is one of the key vehicles for driving wealth, right? Because appreciation allows our properties to increase in value over time when we buy in strategic markets. So by having this factor, by having our properties increase over time, it allows us to sit on these on potentially cash flowing assets, and then really just collect and bank on this appreciation as our properties increase. And that way, in 5, 10, 15 years, not only have you been making money every month, but your property value and your equity positions increase.
The only thing I would add to that, Leroy, is that, as investors, I don't think we should ever invest for appreciation. We should always be looking for cash flow. We should always be looking for the income that's coming out of the property. That way, if you have a market that's, has a downturn, or your market is just kind of stable and it's not appreciating at all, you are still getting money. The property still should be producing income for you. Appreciation should strictly just be the icing on the cake.
Next term is amortization. And basically all amortization is, it applies to loans, right? In real estate, our mortgages, our loans that we take up from banks. And what happens is we pay off these loans in equal installments over time. Now, what's important to understand is that on a regular, typical 30-year fixed mortgage, or even a 15-year fixed mortgage, you will typically pay more interest upfront the first couple of years. And then as you go into years 5, 10, 15, and so on, you're going to be paying more and more down principal. So again, amortization just refers to that equal installments of payments, but just remember that it's not always an equal split between how much you're paying interest to the lender versus how much you're paying down in principal on your mortgage.
Yeah, absolutely. You tend to pay more in interest in the beginning years and then more in principal, like the chart shows, in later years. A lot of people think that if your mortgage is $2,000, $1,000 goes to principal and $1,000 goes to interest. That's not true. The bank really wins in a mortgage situation where they take the bulk of their interest up front and more of your principal. You start to see maybe year 5, year 10, you really start to pay down principal a lot faster. But this is also how wealth is built in real estate as well. If you have tenants making these mortgage payments for you, essentially paying you rent and you paying the mortgage, they're helping you pay off that principal, increasing the value or the equity within the property, and building wealth for you as well. Equity is a beautiful thing. This is, part of the wealth that is built through real estate. So if you're familiar with appreciation, the increase in value, and if you're familiar with amortization, which is the paying down of the debt, everything in between those two numbers, right? So let's say if you buy a property at $300,000 and it appreciates to $350,000, and over time, in that same period of time, you've also paid $50,000 off of the debt while I'm paying your mortgage down to 250. You now have $100,000 in equity. That is the value that you have in the difference between if you sold it and if you paid off that mortgage, you would walk away with $100,000, and that is your equity within the property.
Yeah, and besides the cash flow, I mean, equity is probably one of the more important things to consider because again, this is something that's incredibly powerful over a long period of time. You'll hopefully be making money every single month, but as you continue to own a property for longer and longer, you're going to own a larger chunk of the home, which will increase your equity position. And you can use this in the future too with you can leverage that to go buy other properties, finance anything else you may need in your life. So it really is a key component in your wealth building journey.
Absolutely. And again, people always get confused by the definition of a millionaire. A millionaire is actually a very simple term. It's assets minus liabilities, and that's essentially what equity is as well. If you own a piece of property that's $2 million and you have $1 million loan on it, and that's your only asset, your only liability, that spread between the value of the property and the debt that's on the property is your equity, and that is $1 million right there. You would be a millionaire with a $2 million property and $1 million loan on that property. Okay, 1031 exchange. There's really no calculation here, just as an investor understanding what it is and how you can use it in the future. If you're brand new to real estate investing, it probably wouldn't be something that you're worried about right now. But as you move on in your career, when you go to, let's say you have a property, you bought it at $100,000, it appreciated to $200,000, and you paid off a good chunk of debt. If you go to sell that property, you're going to get hit with capital gains taxes at the federal level. And the federal government wants to encourage you to continue to be a landlord, continue to trade up. So what the 1031 exchange does is allow you to sell that property, defer those capital gains taxes, and then trade those gains up into a larger property. Use that as a down payment for a larger property. So there are a lot of rules around 1031 exchanges. There are certain companies that help take you through the 1031 exchange to make sure that you're following all the tax laws and doing it properly. You have to identify a property within a certain period of time. And you should definitely use a 1031 exchange company if you're going to be doing this exchange.
Yeah, and to give some numbers behind it, just so it's very clear. Let's say you bought a property for $300,000 and you had a $200,000 loan, and 5 years later it's worth $500,000, right? So if you're going to sell that property, you're going to be cashing out $300,000. Now, if you obviously don't want to pay Uncle Sam, its fair share of that $300,000 in profits. So what you can do is just take that $300,000 and roll that into your next property tax free. So you can take that $300,000, put it down as a 25% down payment on a loan, and go buy a $1.2 million building. And which is really the reason why a lot of people use this as a wealth building tool, because it allows you to take all of your previous gains and keep rolling them into larger and larger buildings.
The only thing I would say is tax deferred.
Tax deferred.
Never tax free. Government's always going to take their money eventually. It's tax deferred because they're allowing you to defer it, put it into the next building. Eventually, when you do go to sell that extra building, you will have to pay taxes on that whole lump. Let's say, in Leroy's example, your $300,000 that was supposed to pay capital gains on it. Let's say you traded that up into a larger property. Another $300,000 was accumulated onto that property. Eventually, you would have to pay the capital gains taxes on these $600 as an entire nut.
All right, so ARV, which is after repair value, you're going to hear this all the time in your real estate investing journey, especially if you're going to be implementing any sort of strategies that involve construction and rehab. So all ARV is basically just figuring out what your property is worth that you're looking to buy once it's fixed up, right? So you might be, for example, looking at a $300,000 house that needs maybe $100,000 of work. And you're thinking to yourself, well, if I buy this for 300 and I put in 100, I'm all in for 400. What can I sell it for? What can it be worth once it's done? And if you do an analysis, you can maybe find out that it's worth 600,000, right? So that 600,000 is your after repair value. Again, simply it's just the value of the building that you're buying once you do any sort of work, construction, stabilization, or anything of the sort.
Right. And so to piggyback on Lior's example, and this is not a knock on real estate agents. If you're a real estate agent, Lior and I are both licensed real estate agents ourselves, but a lot of agents don't understand this example. I get calls all the time where agents are like, "Hey, I know you're an investor. Would you like to purchase this property? It's $300,000, and after you fix it up, it'll be worth $400,000." And the question always becomes, well, what is it going to take me to fix it up? And they're like, well, roughly $100,000. And I'm like, well, if I buy it for 3 and I put 100 into it and I'm into it for 4 and it's worth 4, that's not really an investment for me, right? It makes no financial sense. They just look for properties that need work, but the ARV is an important measure because the ARV needs to exceed what it costs you to buy that property and what it costs you to fix it up by an amount that makes financial sense, right? Because even if that number was, let's say, $300,000, $100,000 to fix it up, and that number was $450, well, after I pay my real estate agent, I pay my attorney, I pay, selling costs and any overages, I still haven't made any money. So typically what you find is that the ARV needs to exceed that purchase price plus your renovations by a significant number, sometimes 20 to 25%, depending on your particular market. All right, debt to income ratio, or DTI, another one that's going to be thrown around a lot, specifically on the residential lending side. You're going to hear your mortgage broker talk about DTI a lot. DTI, another very simple calculation. If you have $1,000 every month in gross income, you make $1,000 on your job, and your monthly reported obligations, by reported I mean not necessarily your Comcast bill or your Verizon phone, but your credit card bill, your Sallie Mae student loans, your car payments, those reported debts that are reported to the credit agency, if let's say they are $700 of the $1,000 that you make in gross rental income, that is a 70% debt to income ratio. Typically, when you're working with lenders and you're looking to buy a home, you're looking to invest, most lenders want to see you below a 50% debt to income ratio. And that's even maybe a little aggressive. I think most of them are 48 or somewhere around the 50% mark. So keeping the debt to income ratio in mind, understanding how you can adjust those numbers. For instance, paying off your credit card reduces that payment. If your credit card payment was $200, paying off that $200 credit card, or the balance on that $200 credit card, would bring you back down to a 50% debt to income ratio. So another term that's going to come up over and over again in your real estate investing career.
All right, so our next term is LTV, which stands for the loan to value ratio. And you're going to see this a lot, especially if you're going to be dealing with lenders and banks, which most of us are. So basically, a lender's going to tell you what percentage of the acquisition price they can loan to, right? So if we use, for example, a $100,000 house, the lender might say, hey, Mr. Buyer, you're going to have to put down 30%, and we're going to give you a 70% loan to value loan, right? So in that example, you would put down $30,000 and the lender would lend you $70,000. Now, this ratio can depend on a lot of different things, including your financial strength, the type of lender you might be dealing with, and the type of property you might be dealing with. So, there could be LTVs can range from anywhere as low as 50% to as high as 90 and even 95% on some owner-occupant instances. So it's really important to understand the different scenarios, the different types of lenders, and your personal situation when trying to figure out what the right LTV is.
Yeah, LTV is a term that's going to be used in your real estate investment career over and over and over again. This is one of those more important terms that you really need to understand. It's a really simple calculation, as Lior mentioned. $100,000 property, you owe $70,000 on a property. It's a $70,000 70% loan to value ratio, right? It also comes into play when if I can back up, there's a lot of old school thinking, right? If you lived in the 1950s and 1960s, the goal back then was to stay on your job, pay off your mortgage, and retire to a point where you had no debt whatsoever. If you know anything about the movement of money or the velocity of money, you want to re-leverage yourself out there. So let's say, for instance, that same $100,000 property, you owed $30,000 on it, right? Right now you have a 30% loan to value ratio. Knowing that most banks would lend up to 70 or 80% LTV, you have the opportunity to go out and borrow, 50 or 40 to $50,000 on that asset, assuming that the rents cover. That $50,000 can now be taken and re-leveraged to go buy another property. So LTV is going to be something that's used over and over again, and something you definitely need to be familiar with.
All right, a pro forma. So a pro forma is really just a gathering of all the data for a specific property. So it'll include your top line income, right, which is the rent you're going to collect for a specific rental property, as well as any of your expenses, which can include everything from taxes to insurance to maintenance and everything in between that will be included in operating this property. Now, a lot of times, if you're going to be looking for property, you might ask for pro formas from the listing agent or the seller, and just be aware that a lot of the times people like to what's called juice up your pro forma. They will put numbers that are maybe not so realistic, right? They will put higher rents than maybe the market commands and lower expenses than what it really costs to operate that property. So when analyzing pro formas, especially if they're not pro formas that you have made in the past, that you have not made, you want to really be critical and kind of question all the assumptions and make sure you're comfortable with those numbers presented to you.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, if you're brand new and you're in the residential space, residential has all types of, the RESPA laws and all types of, regulatory, bodies that oversee residential real estate to protect the consumer. Once you get into 5 units or above, and that's what we're talking about. When we say commercial here, we're not talking about storefronts necessarily. We're not talking about supermarkets. We're talking about anything that's residential, 5 units above is commercial space. It is the Wild West, meaning you do not have all the protections from the government. You have to do your own due diligence. Like Leor said, you really want to make sure that you're checking the numbers on your pro forma and doing the due diligence to make sure that those numbers are correct at the end of the day. Okay, return on investment. Return on investment is another simple measure. It basically is just telling you what are you getting back for your money. So again, really, really simple calculation. If I invest $100 into an investment and in year one, I get back $7, I had a 7% return on investment. This is going to apply in your real estate career. Your investment might be your down payment, your closing costs, the repairs that you made to the building. If I put, $50,000 in down payment and closing costs and another $50,000 in repairs, I've invested $100,000 into that building. If I get $7,000 back in my first year, I have, again, a 7% return on investment. And again, it's just another financial measure to determine how well that investment or that property is performing for you.
NOI, which simply stands for net operating income. Now, this is a really important term that's used in commercial real estate a lot. And again, commercial real estate here is, we're not saying it's only storefronts or office space. It really is anything that's just simply greater than 5 units. So your net operating income in terms of the formula is really just your gross income that you're going to collect for a property minus all of your operating expenses. So operating expenses can be your insurance, it can be your taxes, it can be your repairs, your maintenance, a vacancy budget, a budget for your landscaper and snow removal. But what's critical to know about this net operating income, and the reason why it's used, is it's completely independent of financing and does not account for mortgage payments. So whether you put down a 10% down payment or a 50% down payment, your net operating income for a property should stay the same, which is why investors like to evaluate properties based on that, because again, it's completely independent of your financing options. It's strictly, how does this property perform from an income perspective and an operational perspective?
All right, cap rate. Cap rate is another simple measure often used in the commercial real estate world. You won't hear this tossed around too much in the residential space. Again, when we're talking about commercial, we're talking about typically 5 units or above of residential living. So cap rate is basically your net operating income divided by the purchase price. And the measure that you're trying to get with the cap rate is the measure of performance, whether you're looking at a new building and you're trying to figure out how it's going to perform, or you're trying to sell your existing building to a new client and you're basically saying, I have a 7 cap, I have a 10 cap. And basically what you'll find with 10 caps are the lower the cap rate, you usually find a lower cap rate in a higher class neighborhood and with newer development, right? If a building that's built in the last 10 or 15 years is going to have a lower cap rate because the performance of that building is expected to be higher because there's less maintenance and everything else. Whereas you have a building who's 20, 30, 40 years old, you might have a higher cap rate because there is going to be more expenses. There are going to be other problems with the building. You might have a higher cap rate for a building with a neighborhood that might be more problems within that neighborhood as well, right? If I'm going to go into a more troubled neighborhood, I'm going to expect a higher performance or on that property as well. I might need something above double digits in terms of my cap rate. So you're going to hear cap turned around. It's a 10 cap, it's a 4 cap, it's a 2 cap. You're going to hear that term thrown around a lot in your investment career, and all you really need to know is it's actually the measure of the performance of that property. Some investors are going to want a 4 cap because they want to be in more desirable trophy asset neighborhoods, and some investors are going to want something that's above a double-digit cap because they are looking in more blue-collar neighborhoods for their investments.
And the only thing I'd add to that is because the cap rate is independent of financing, if you really read between the lines of what we're saying, it really is a measure of risk almost. An investor that's gonna take a 4 cap property is gonna be in a really desirable neighborhood for a really good property that's in great condition. Whereas if you've got a greater risk tolerance but you want greater returns, then you're gonna go into either quote unquote worse neighborhoods, or you're going to go into older buildings that need more work, but you'll get a higher return, right? That's why instead of a 4 cap, you'll get an 8 cap, which will give you more income for that same purchase price. All right, so Capex, which stands for capital expenditures. Basically, we are buying real estate, and we're in the real estate business. And what it means, and when you're in the real estate business, you're also in the business of concrete, brick, and mortar. And what happens a lot as you own buildings over a long period of time, you're going to have things that degrade, right? Big things like your roof, things like your foundation, things like your siding, your mechanicals, like your plumbing and electrical. And these are all big ticket items that over a long period of time need to be accounted for in an investment. So when we talk about accounting for CapEx, it's not the monthly maintenance where you have maybe a leaky toilet or a leaky faucet or a clogged toilet, but we're talking about the big expenses that can cost you $5, $10, $15, and $1,000 and much more. So when we are evaluating investments, it's really important for us to make some sort of assumptions and give some sort of budget to the CapEx, which basically says, hey, I know I'm going to have to replace my roof. I know I'm going to have to replace my siding, maybe not today, maybe in 10 years, but we have to budget for all of these big things today.
Right. There's some tax implications there as well. Neither one of us are CPAs, but when you have a common expense or an operating expense, it is expensed and written off against your income in the same year. CapEx or capital expenditures are depreciated over time, right? When let's say you spend $6,000 fixing up your roof, or replacing your roof, should I say, your accountant is going to put that on your tax as a capital expenditure or CapEx, and it is actually going to be depreciated, or you're going to get that $6,000 written off over a period of 10 years or 6 years or whatever it may be at the current federal rates. So there is some tax implications there when you talk about repairs and operating expenses versus capital expenditures as well.
All right, so cash on cash return, or sometimes you'll see it as COC. So basically, it is the holy grail of cash flow investing. And what cash on cash return basically accounts for is the amount of money you're going to receive on a monthly basis compared to the amount of money you had to put down into the deal to acquire the property. So let's go over that. So in terms of your bulk number, that's gonna include your down payment, right? So whether you put down 10%, 20%, or 30%, you're gonna have some sort of down payment number. You're also gonna have things like closing costs and things like construction budgets and all that. And that's gonna be your upfront investment into the rental property. And hopefully, once you do all of that and you have tenants in there, you're going to be generating monthly income. And let's say you're going to be generating $1,000 per month, right? If that's the income you're going to be getting every single month, and let's say it took you $100,000 to get into the deal, now you're generating $12,000 per year on a $100,000 investment is a 12% cash-on-cash return. So again, it's basically like ROI, except we're basically just strictly accounting for how much monthly income we're making as opposed to the amount of money it took us to get into this rental property. All right, so let's go to the next term, which is the debt coverage ratio, also known as the debt service coverage ratio. Now, all this ratio really is just looking at the ratio between your monthly mortgage payment versus your income after your fixed expenses for your property. Now, fixed expenses can be your taxes, insurance, your maintenance, that kind of thing, and your lender will help you figure that out. Now, the reason for this ratio is you're gonna wanna know by how much does my income that I take home every month after my expenses cover the monthly mortgage payment, right? And your lender's gonna wanna know that as well. So let's say, for example, you got a $1,000 monthly mortgage payment, and your income after expenses for your rental property is going to be $1,200. You're going to have a ratio of 1.2, right? Which essentially is you're covering your mortgage payment by 20%, which is great. Now, it's really important to understand that residential lenders aren't typically going to ask for this ratio. It's really more used on the commercial side. But as an investor, you're going to want to know this for yourself so that you can properly feel comfortable with the amount of debt that you're taking on for your investment property.
Okay. Internal rate of return, or IRR. So if we back up and we talk about the return on investment, in order to understand IRR, well, let's talk about return on investment, the measure that most people use. If you invest $100,000 into something and you get $7,000 back your first year in cash flow, because we're talking about real estate here, in cash flow, you've made a 7% return on investment. That's great, but what you've left out is the property is also appreciating, and the debt is also being paid down by your tenants as well, right? So every month there's a portion of your principal being paid down, and your property is appreciating at a rate as well. So those are three different ways that you're making money, but return on investment only counts one of them. IRR, or the internal rate of return, solves that problem and takes into account all three. It includes the measure of appreciation, cash flow, and debt pay down all into one measure, while also taking into a consideration the time that you've held the investment as well. So the internal rate of return is a better measure for calculating all of the components or all of the ways that real estate pays you back on your investment.
Exactly. And IRR, you'll see IRR being used in the commercial space a lot. If you're ever going to be raising money, you're going to have your investors typically evaluate your investment from an IRR perspective, because it allows them to equally see where the better opportunity is based on the amount of cash that they're going to be receiving, as well as time, because at the end of the day, the basic principle is the time value of money. So people, the very sophisticated investors, want to be analyzing all returns in context of time, and that's why they'll be analyzing your opportunities with this return metric as well.
Payback period. Payback period is something I use on a regular basis. I think about just kind of the way I think. If I put $50,000 into a real estate investment, and that real estate investment is producing me $10,000 per year, then I have a 5-year payback period. It's basically how quickly can I get my money back out? It's my break-even point. I look at it and I compare investments and I say, hey, my money is trapped into this investment for 10 years versus, hey, I can get my money, my payback period, and I can exit this investment or get my cash back out. still hold on to that investment property, but put that money back into my pocket. Obviously, a shorter payback period or break even point is better than a long one.
All right, vacancy rate. So vacancy rate is a critical assumption to you we need to take into account when we're dealing with multifamily. And basically, all a vacancy rate assumes is that you are never going to have your property rented out 100% of the time. Whether it's a single family or whether you have 20 units, at some point you're going to have a tenant that either moves out of the property or leaves, and you're going to have some sort of vacancy where you're not collecting income. So we have to make some sort of percentage assumption that says, hey, there's going to be a certain amount of income that we're going to lose every single month because of tenants moving in and out of the apartment. Now, vacancy rates are very market specific. So you need to understand what the economics, what the supply and demand is within your specific market. And there are many ways to research this rate. By talking to investors, talking to brokers, looking at government websites. But basically, you want to get that assumption because, again, you don't want to be the one assuming that you're going to have your unit rented 100% of the time, because that's just not feasible over a long period of time. All right, cash flow. So cash flow is one of the main reasons why we love investing in rental property. And all cash flow is it accounts for your gross income that you're going to be collecting for your property, minus all of your expenses for the property, minus your mortgage. And it basically is your take-home number, if you will, the amount of money that you're going to be able to take home on a month-to-month basis. So again, the reason why we invest for cash flow is because we're always going to be generating income every single month. And if we can own one or even multiple properties, we're going to be generating cash flow from different sources, and again, increasing our income through these rental properties.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, cash flow is the only reason that we're in the business. Cash flow is what financial freedom is all about. If you listen to any of our stuff, you'll know that, we're all about, retirement, retiring early, trying to get to that financial freedom number, and cash flow is the number that gets you there. Lior gave you the more technical definition, but if at the end of the day, cash flow is what we're trying to get to, right? If you have $1,000 coming in from, each property that you own, and you own 10 properties, that's $10,000 a month or $120,000 a year that you are generating passively. And if you can do that, and let's say that you were also living, your household income was $120,000 a year, you've essentially replaced your household income, and you are technically financially free. You can live off the cash flow, quit your job, and move on. Cash flow is king, and that's why we're all here.
All right, guys, thanks so much for watching our videos. Hopefully you guys understood all those terms. And if you didn't, go back through all of them. Make sure you really understand the implications of each one of those terms, because you will be using all of them in your investing journey. So once you kind of have a firm grip on these, then feel free to move on to our other free courses, whether it's buying your first investment property or more complex topics. But make sure you really have a grasp on these so you can really understand everything moving forward.
Absolutely, guys. Same here. Definitely understand these terms. There are a lot of important ones that are going to help you throughout your investing career. Make sure you connect with us on social or Instagram. We are also on YouTube as well. A lot of free content that we're putting out there. Don't forget to download the documents that we have attached to this free training. That'll help you kind of navigate those terms as well. And we hope to catch you on the next training.